We're gonna switch the topic from the things to the process of conservation. I'm always in trying to pin down exactly how to describe what conservators do. And so this is another stab at it. How many people are conservators? And how many aren't? Okay. Well, there's going to be a lot of these issues that I'm going to mention that will, I think, come up in a lot of the papers in the next couple days. All right, let me start. The job of professional conservators is to preserve things that have been selected for long-term preservation by others. I think that's a rather something we don't necessarily think about very often. And the kind of things that we preserve are so varied that one of the big problems about writing about conservation is that you can't figure out a word to describe the stuff that you're treating. So I usually simply call them objects, which confuses conservators a lot, but cultural property doesn't seem to be a very pleasant way to describe them. Now, conservation treatments really address two goals at the same time: preservation and use, which includes museum exhibitions, home decoration, education, and research. The preservation part is entirely material and fact-based. Information about the physical object comes from examination, which also gives us information about the object's history as well as its physical attributes. The second goal, I don't think use is necessarily a great name for that either, but we're kind of stuck with it. The second goal has intangible aspects: meanings, values, and aesthetics. Information in this area includes projected use, the owner's feelings, and also comes from our own knowledge of history. There's no one right way to treat any object. Another thing that I think some of my colleagues start to squirm when this topic comes up. Everything we treat has so many unique qualities that we really have to start from scratch, in our heads at least, when we have something to treat. One of the interesting phenomena related to objects and their different meanings happens with portraits. In art museums, portraits are art, and the artist's name is in big letters at the top of the labels. And in history museums, the big labels are the sitter. And often nobody in each of these places cares about the other. So I think a lot of objects have entirely other meanings in museums: how old they are, where they come from, whether they came from a shipwreck or another kind of archaeological source. The reason that people see things in museums changes all the time, which is partly why sometimes deciding on treatments gets very complicated. So, planning a conservation treatment requires information that we get from examining the object, also information from the owner or custodian, and of course sometimes from our colleagues and other professionals. Some conservation treatments do not make visible changes to an object, but of course most do. And it's very important obvious. I hope it's obvious, but sometimes not. It's important that the conservator discuss possible changes with the owner as part of the treatment plan. None of us want our clients to be overly surprised at the end of a treatment. And we, a lot of times, base certain parts of our treatments to what the client wants. Knowing the history of an object helps us to determine what museum people sometimes call its time of most significance. This usually falls into one of three categories: when it was new, when it was in use, or when it was collected. Works of art are usually in the first category. We want to see the work as the artist's hand left it and the best possible depiction of his or her intention. Outsider art is normally in this category. And I think one of the interesting things about the history of outsider art is it got to be art early on, and folk art early on was more thought of as the arts and crafts kind of thing. Objects like carriages, furniture, and machinery are often shown as they appeared during use rather than when they were new. Some utilitarian objects are collected when they're no longer fit for use. They may be broken or have missing parts or simply look tired. Conservation treatment can bring the item to a state close to what it looked like when it was used. So usually when utilitarian things are exhibited as they were used, we're not talking about art museums anymore. We're talking about history museums or living museums or other kinds of places. The as-found state is much less common. Certain historical objects, such as 9/11 artifacts, or houses left as they were when their owner died, are examples. These tend to be situations with a high emotional or commemorative component. And I think clearly Paradise, that site is one of these where we almost want to see the dead owner standing in the shadows when we visit. In the 1960s and 70s, when collectors of folk art started to lend to art museums, some of them took up this idea, the as collected idea, and refused to allow even layers of gray dust to be removed. Perhaps because the collectors themselves had found these previously unappreciated objects in out-of-the-way places, they may have wanted the objects to reflect the condition at the time that they discovered them. Whatever the motive, this preference, luckily, has mostly yielded to the museum model of judicious cleaning, and folk art is treated like other art categories, although it took a while to get there. The original name of the Folk Art Museum in New York was the Museum of Early American Folk Arts, as in arts and crafts. Many of the pieces in their collections are utilitarian objects that were appropriated by 20th century collectors as works of art. This includes ceramic jugs, shaker furniture, weather vanes, quilts, advertising signs, and a lot of other things. And while Paul and I were talking about this, we realized that we've never seen a weather vane mounted so that it turns in the wind. I think that would be kind of interesting to see what weather vanes looked like when they were weather vanes. Changing from arts and crafts to art has many implications. One is that humans are attracted to art and they want it to be preserved and permanently accessible to the public. Art usually has higher monetary value than mere decorative or arts and crafts items. And the process of making these things in the public eye means that art dealers get involved, and once that happens, as is seen in many of the biographies of outsider artists, the dealer's hand in all of this can make a big change in what is produced. The one conservation-related difference, I think, with folk art is that there are times when folk art collections are not small damages and that sort of thing, or small losses aren't repaired to the degree that, that most conservators would do with sort of traditional art. One of the interesting things I find about outsider art now that it's gotten sort of commercialized is that, that it's defined by the kind of person who made it. Even though if you put on exhibits of outsider art and traditional contemporary sculpture, for example, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference between one another. And a lot of contemporary artists who come out of art schools are making things that are as, I want to say, wacky as some some outsider art artists are making. Outsider art has gotten the title of art from the beginning, and it may be that because most outsider art is paintings, it's works on paper, it's sculpture, and I think that fits in with mainstream art quite easily. Site-specific art is a whole different category, and usually it's site-specific art. I don't know that people use that expression, but we're talking about buildings with, a lot of times with furnishings, and of course a lot of times with sculpture gardens. And this is really a situation where normally you want it to stay in the same state as when the owner died. Usually the artists create sculpture and set the placement of the sculpture, and everything involved is considered part of the work of art. As we, I think, know, and as we're going to see later, that is preserving this sort of thing is really difficult and requires community input. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this works here, and I think that the discussion we had before my paper was interesting because of the number of people who are involved in the project. If you're interested in learning more about some of these issues about decision making and who makes the decisions and how they make the decisions, there are two very good sources. One is the AIC Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice. If you're not a conservator and you haven't read this, it's quite an interesting, they're quite interesting documents. They go very much further than just ethics. And the website of the AIC, which is the American Organization for Conservators, has a website, and if you Google AIC and put in conservation because there's a lot of other organizations that are AICs. You can get on the AIC website, and they're called core documents if you have trouble finding them in the on the site. The other thing that I have to recommend is my most recent book, which is called Conservation Treatment Methodology and is on Amazon. And many people who are not conservators seem to find it very interesting. And some of my friend conservators find it very hard to read. So if you can make sense out of that, I'd like to hear that explanation. Okay, so I don't know if you want to ask questions now, or if some of these weird topics will pop up, I think, in a lot of the papers. There's obviously a lot of different ways of looking at these things. So, as I say, I don't know if you want questions now or, yeah, okay. Okay, Paul's going to show pictures.
Gotta have pictures.
Yeah, we gotta have pictures.
So now if we can get back to this, I guess if I open this up, I'll let you.
Yeah, we'll grab the AV at the break next.
Can we turn down now? These are a little hard to see. Okay, so to try and answer a little more of the question that's at the top of our talk about whether there is a difference between the conservation of folk art and outsider art and other things, I think that we're trying to show in the few slides that I'm going to show that there really is, there are some differences, but mostly there are shared, most of it is shared, and that we don't see this as a very separate topic. That the idea that we treat each object as it comes along, I think, is much more important than whether these different categories should be separated. I asked before a specific question about framing because it's something that particularly interests me, but here you see two paintings, one tinsel painting and one by a man named Ralph Fazzanella from the Folk Art Museum, and both, the one on the left came with a strip frame, and it was the one that Ralph had put on it, I think more out of financial consideration than anything else. I'm not sure he actually chose it because he felt it was appropriate. But the effect that frames can have, and we understand now in American art particularly and in European art too, frames have become incredibly important and unfortunately incredibly expensive. But they do make a huge difference in the appearance of these things and the choice of what kind of a frame to put on a particular work and what a particular artist might or might not have wanted for their particular thing is, I think, one that often gets left as a haphazard choice at the end. And I don't think it should be. I think it's a really critical decision. And it clearly is a decision that should be made sort of as you begin to do the treatment. The other thing that we face all the time are missing parts. The gentleman on the right from the Newark Museum had a cigar originally. He's a cigar store figure that had a cigar. The people at the museum decided they didn't want to replace this cigar. One of the problems was if you put a cigar in, what kind of a cigar was it? You know, was it long? Is it fat? Is it whatever? And no one had any idea. There were no photographs that showed it, so no. On the left, a piece of sculpture that had a sword. Again, the owner, an institution, decided, perfectly reasonably, I think, that we had no idea what the sword looked like originally, so it doesn't get a sword. But the way these are interpreted by the public and viewers is affected by whether we replace these missing pieces or not. And I think that's a really important decision that needs to be discussed rather than just assuming that we don't do it. The figure on the right, a weather vane, was treated, obviously a lot of paint loss. Question comes up constantly. How much of the loss do we compensate for? It would have been possible to in-paint this to make it look the way it did when it was new. It was as used. It belongs to the Folk Art Museum. No, it doesn't. It's a private collector, sorry. And the decision early on was consolidate the paint that's there and don't put anything back. The piece on the left was belonged to a private owner. It had been hung from the neck. It had been pulled apart, and it was put together, and there was some compensation made. It's a personal piece. It always had looked like a whole piece, and so we put it back to make it look like a whole piece. Very different decision, very different use, very different interpretation. As Barbara and I were talking, Barbara mentioned, I'd love to see these things. You know, weather vanes are not supposed to be still. They moved around, and they're also, always this question, they were seen from a very low vantage point. And the question of where you put these things, interesting that that large piece from Paradise Garden, which was up on a building, is now shown in a gallery at almost eye level, which changes its appearance considerably. And how do you make those decisions, and should you then try and actually show it at a high vantage point where it might have been intended to be from the start? This is a piece of an airplane from World War II. Brought to us, it was a relic, as found on the left. The owner wanted it to look much more visible and much more, so it was the image that was important here, and so we were able to, didn't change color as much as the photograph would indicate, always a problem, but it was shown as the image. It's not, it's a kind of relic, but in a different way. It's in a plexi box, and he can hang it on his wall. It's owned privately, again, so that makes a great deal of difference in how the final version of this looks. A fireman's hat. It came in as up in the left corner, and again, it's very difficult when there are missing pieces for the ordinary viewer to understand or to fill in, whereas people who are either scholars or collectors or knowledgeable viewers might say, oh, I understand how that was used, I understand what it looked like, we could have left it in the condition at upper left, but this belongs to an institution, and it was, in discussions with the institution, they wanted it back the way it looked originally, and I think it makes sense because obviously the firemen didn't use it. This break occurred after use, and it was to demonstrate what a fireman's hat would have looked like when it was used as a fireman's hat. And again, these are questions of how is this going to be used for educational purposes? How does the viewer see these things? What message does it give the viewer? And I think conservation treatments often don't take into account what the message is that the viewer has to take away from these objects. They are telling someone a story, and if the story is interrupted or not visible to the viewer, it doesn't serve the purpose it is intended to serve. The piece on the left is a contemporary work. It's a bee. It's about 18 inches long. It's heavy. It came to this, it was made in Europe. It came to this country. It broke in half. We're not showing you the details. It was excruciating to put back because of its weight. It's quite heavy. It was intended to hang upside down like this. We've actually reversed the photograph that we took of it during treatment. But it has to hang from its legs. And there are several versions of this. The artist, actually, people buy these to hang in their homes. We had a photograph of this from a collector in Europe who had one of these hanging in their kitchen. It's very lifelike. It's even a little hard to see here, but it's quite startling. And the legs were made out of a very thin and poor quality aluminum. And one of them had broken during transit, along with the body. The body and the whatever it is, the stomach and the thorax had separated right there, which is, of course, the weakest point, and we had it for months and months before we figured out what to do with it. But putting it up again in the person's home was one of the most difficult parts of this. We had to figure out how to drill in. There are screws that go through the little paws on whatever you call them at the ends of the legs, and you can see them sort of right here and here. These are the weakest points, and we had to make, we had a large size of relief when we left this thing. It was still hanging on the ceiling after we put it up. It didn't break again. But there's Charlie McCarthy. This, owned by private collector, it's one of the original versions of Charlie McCarthy. I don't know how, there aren't many of them. We were asked by the owner to put him in a seated position. Why? Because it was supposed to go into a bookshelf that was of a certain height. So, you know, it could have been shown standing, might have been used, probably was used standing, although it might have been on Edgar Bergen's knee when he showed it, so who knows. We didn't make a knee, but there's also, it was rather convenient because this little block here, which is is hollow, has silica gel in it, so, and it's in a plexi case. But again, you know, how is it going to be exhibited is one of those questions that comes up constantly, particularly not just in private practice, I think in any place, whether it's going into a home or into an institution, the question of what it's going to look like when it's on exhibit and how much access you need to have when it's not on exhibit, all those questions need to come up. This was a trunk this is not the Lincoln trunk. This is supposed to have belonged to Wild Bill Hickok. It has all these documents on the inside that are somehow related to him. The owner did not want it to look new. They wanted it to look, to consolidate it essentially, but it was not supposed to look as made, or it's really supposed to look as found. The documents, some of the documents were secured so that they weren't falling off the thing, but the value of this, to the owner at least, was that it looked like it had been used by, if it was Wild Bill Hickok, great. So these decisions are made, again, specifically in conjunction with the owner. And here's a piece that belongs to the Folk Art Museum, Day of the Dead figure. The hair, which is a wig, obviously, came in this condition. And we had some discussions with the curators about what it was supposed to look like. Barbara worked on it. We didn't use hair softener, or we didn't wash it. But it was braided slightly to make it look a little less. It's quite a startling piece, but also this is the way we set it up in the lab because it has to be. It has to have all these parts that look like it did when it was collected, at least, or when it was exhibited originally, or when it was made. We needed to work with them to come up with some method of attaching the looms properly and all the rest of it. It's interesting that the photographs we saw of the collection in this museum are almost all flat pieces. That's why I asked the question before. How do you decide how to exhibit these things that are probably, when made, were loose drawings, as most drawings are. And as we know, European drawings were mostly shown or collected in albums. And the way they're shown now in museums has nothing to do with the way they were intended to be seen by the artists. Often they were not even intended to be seen. They were used as process drawings for a work of art that was being made. And the question of how you exhibit them and how you present them to the public and how they understand what they were intended to look like, I think is very much shared by any work on paper. And those decisions really should, again, be thought out. You know, what we see often in museums now with old master drawings are very simple mats with ivory mats, ragboard mats, whereas in the 19th century they might have had very elaborate French mats that were in very elaborate frames, and before that people actually looked at them in their bound volumes. So how you actually, it's very different when you look at a drawing on your lap or on a desk in a volume than when you look at it on the wall as a work of art. And I think it changes your whole connection with these flat pieces. And again, Barbara and I have always talked about making these decisions as decisions rather than automatic things that you just do. That is, the discussion needs to take place. This is an Egyptian Coptic slipper that was owned by a dealer, And the important part of this, aside from the fact that it's one of a pair, actually, this piece at the top, the part that made it into a sandal, was crushed and not attached very well. And it was important, in order to show what the use of this piece was, that this actually be supported so that it looked like it did when it was either used or might have been used. And actually, Barbara used, I think, pipe cleaners, wasn't that? Yeah, pipe cleaners are a really useful thing sometimes. But the three-dimensional quality of this piece it's extraordinary in its design, and actually, Barbara did an insert underneath parts of them so that the design was visible without actually restoring the whole piece. But visually, it was back to what it might have looked like somewhat when it was actually either, as I said, in use. And here, I'm afraid these photographs are kind of misleading in some way, but this is a paint, it's Russian. It's a painting on a window shade. And it was done by, I think, the grandmother of the owner. It came to us in this condition with missing pieces here, and you can see all the white things. The owner wanted it to look like it did when it was made. So we filled in all of these white areas with, this is not actually, it's not gesso, which it looks like on the photograph, but it's actually three-dimensional pieces of, I can't remember, was it ragboard? I think ragboard that was, and then woven in so that they really did look, when you looked at it, like the window shade, and then they were in-painted. And one of the problems that you have, I think there are other times when you might leave these either toned, what we call a neutral color, which is never actually a neutral color. It's neutral today, tomorrow it's 1982's color. But we filled them all in and in-painted them, and when you looked at the piece, it looked complete, which is one of the reasons, aside from the desire of the owner to have it look like it did when his grandmother made it, is that when you have things like this that are white or whatever, your eye goes to those first. That's what you see. And that's not the point of something like this. And so trying to get those additions to fade into the background so that you look at the piece and not what we've done is always, I think, a real hard thing to do. And that's it.